My novel, Hopatcong Vision Quest, is a past life mystery. 2 drownings occur in Lake Hopatcong. The daughter of one of the victims believes these deaths were murders, although the police have declared them both accidents. Diane and her friends contact Glenn Wiley, a past life regression hypnotist who pulls memories of a life they shared as Native Americans living in the same area. The book takes place in both modern times and the beginning of the 17th century, when Europeans first made contact with the Native Americans living near the ponds that eventually formed Lake Hopatcong. I'm going to read 2 sections, one from the beginning and one from an early regression. We begin with Laurie's point of view. Time slowed while the overturned tractor-trailer spun toward Gary's car. The trailer slid on its side, wheels spinning in the air, soaring straight at him, skidding across the pavement like a rolling boulder. Gary's eyes froze on the huge steel load until the mass hit, startling Laurie from her nightmare. She sat up in bed, inhaled a deep breath, and stood, her nightgown so drenched in sweat she needed to change. She stretched, paced for a few minutes, then moved to her bathroom where she swallowed an Ambien. Whenever Laurie dreamed of the accident, her dream was always a nightmare, and always the same graphic, painful experience. But each time Laurie imagined the accident while she was awake, she didn't think of the pain. Instead, she wondered what went through her husband's mind. Did her image come to him just before he died, perhaps in the light spring nightgown that had once been his favorite? Did he picture her holding Diane when their child was a newborn? Were his wife and daughter in his heart thought of as 2 gifts from God fixed in time? Or were Gary's last thoughts of that other woman? Laurie found it easier to cope when her 27-year-old daughter Diane was with her. But today Diane was at her apartment in Caldwell, and Laurie was turning to wine to help her forget. She was sipping her 4th glass of Cabernet Sauvignon, which had as much to do with the way her world was spinning as the grief did. It was a cool day in late September. Laurie wore a flannel shirt and an old pair of jeans, work clothes once belonging to her husband. She intended to restart her garden. The good days had passed for the peppers, eggplants, and tomatoes, so now it was time to make a fall planting. She would put in radishes, cabbage, and broccoli, vegetables that thrived in the cooler weather. Her home was on the shore of Lake Hopatcong in New Jersey on a peninsula named Prospect Point, and her garden was a small plot beside the seawall. The New Jersey soil and abundant water from the lake provided a perfect place to plant. The garden was generally productive, and she was sure it would be again, even if planted while she was dizzy. Laurie swallowed a mouthful of wine, then got down on her knees. At 56 years old, standing and bending flared her arthritis and reminded her she was aging like her withered plants. The world was more stable than when she was on all fours. She laughed at that, although she wasn't sure why. She wrapped her fingers around the stalk of a tomato plant that had been good to her for the last couple of months. She pulled, and the stalk broke off. She knew from experience that the plant's roots were at least a foot deep and would best be dug with a shovel. She dug with her fingers anyway, because she liked the feel of topsoil on her bare hands. She wished she, like this garden, could get a fresh start. She sniffed, then wiped her eyes and nose on the sleeve of her shirt, or rather, Gary's shirt. She held her face against her arm and breathed in the damp flannel odor that smelled like her husband. 4 months had passed since the accident. She should have learned to deal with those emotions by now, but here she was, crying again. Laurie felt a hand on her shoulder, then another grabbing the cloth of her shirt. She turned to see who was holding her, but her eyes couldn't focus. They were filled with tears, and the world was still spinning. Whoever had grabbed her was pushing now, to the seawall and over into the lake. The cold water brought Laurie back to her senses. She hadn't caught a breath. The water was only 4 foot deep. She struggled to stand, but someone was holding her down, keeping her head under water. Her eyes were open, and the lake was clear. She saw the lower part of the seawall and rocks, waterlogged sticks, and mucky leaves on the bottom. Her lungs hurt too much. She couldn't hold her breath even a minute. She gasped and choked. The world swirled, then went dark. The next section is further along in the novel. Glenn Wiley regresses Diane to a former life, and this is what she experiences as a Lenape woman, Udadabin. This is from Udadabin's point of view. "Something is in the woods," Udadabin said. "Something wrong?" Pools asked. "I'm not certain, but it's bright and out of place." Udadabin shifted from one foot to the other to look from different angles. She tilted her head and stepped to the right. The reflection reappeared, but only for an instant. They had been picking at the edge of thicker woods where the berry bushes grew well. Udadabin stepped toward the place where the forest was dense. Careful, it could be a bear. Poole's voice was tense and sharp. A shiny bear? Udadabin smiled wide. When she laughed, all her teeth showed. You know what I mean. It's dangerous to follow what you don't know. Nuda made a soft cry. Poole set down her basket and went to the tree where her baby was tied in the cradle. Both Udadabin and Pools were dressed for the heat of the summer in wraparound skirts with no tops, making it easy for Pools to feed her daughter. She carried Nuda in her left arm, stepped back to the bush, and continued to pick, filling her basket where it sat on the ground. Udadabin turned away from Pools and Nuda to look back. Pools said, "There isn't much light in the woods. The sun would have to be peeking through a break in the leaves to reflect off a surface. What is the chance of that?" "Are you saying I imagined it?" "I'm saying it's unusual." Udadabin leaned to her right to try to see clearer. "Perhaps it's a sign," she said. "I'll show you a sign. See how I'm picking more berries than you despite working with one hand? That's a sign of someone not doing her job." Udadabin looked at Pools. She noticed Nuda's face was turned from her mother's breast. "Is your daughter done feeding?" Pools dropped a handful of berries in the basket, then repositioned her baby on her other breast. Udadabin smiled and stepped toward the woods again. She saw something move. At first she thought it was a deer, but she noticed a head of thick hair, which she could tell belonged to a person dressed in buckskin clothing. "Someone's lying on the ground." "A shiny person?" Udadabin didn't have time to respond to Poole's sarcasm. "There really is a person there, someone who may be hurt." She started to take another step, but Pools had hold of her skirt. "What if it's a white man or an Iroquois? We have to help. You watch from a distance. I'll get one of the boys to run for a Hopatcong." Pools turned and headed toward the others, still holding her child. Udadabin knew Pools was right. If someone was faking, the situation could be dangerous. If not, the injured person needed a shaman. She stepped back and breathed deeply. "What if this is the sign I've waited for?" she thought. Udadabin glanced in the direction her friend had run. Pools would come back after she sent a boy to run for a Hopatcong, and others would come with her. She only had a few minutes to be alone. She breathed deeply and walked into the woods. A white man with light brown hair and a thick beard lay there, breathing unevenly. His right arm was under his body, but she noticed a portion of a large gash in it. Udadabin knew she had to stop the bleeding. She pulled on his unconscious body, rolling him so she could see the wound clearer. A long blade had been partially caught underneath him and now wasn't. She picked up the enormous knife. She saw blood on the blade and a glittery red stone in the decorative handle. The blood caused her to wonder if the man had defended himself. Could he have survived a bear attack? Also, under his body was a long object which looked like a case for the blade. She shoved the blade beneath a bush, then undid a belt that held the case to the man's waist. She put the case and its belt beside the blade. Udadabin needed something to stop the bleeding. She looked at the man's clothes. They were dirty and it would be hard to get them off. She thought of the light beaver blanket in Nuda's cradle. It would be a good size. She stood up and stepped back into the clearing. Pools had left the blanket there, and at the foot of the tree was a gourd water bottle. Udadabin grabbed both items and returned to the man. She used water from the gourd to clean the wound as thoroughly as she could, then wrapped the blanket around his arm. If the blood had been flowing quickly, she would have placed the blanket closer to his shoulder and twisted it with a stick. But the man had been lying on his arm. His position had caused the wound to fill with dirt, which helped to slow the bleeding. The novel continues with a number of other regressions as this group of friends learn they were all part of the life in the Lenape village. Events are repeated and relationships continued, sometimes in unusual ways. Hopatcong Vision Quest is a story about a magical place, but it's also about how people, with all their flaws and strengths, are the same whatever the time or place.